The afternoon light over Ironbottom Sound shimmered like molten glass, the air heavy with the tang of burned fuel and salt spray. Lieutenant Harold "Red" Fowler of the 67th Fighter Squadron gripped the stick of his Bell P-39 Airacobra as the altimeter needle trembled past 3,000 feet. Below him, a single grey-green dot spiraled through the haze, a Mitsubishi A6M0, its wingtips glinting like knives. The enemy pilot was good. They all were. Fowler had just finished his third pass when the world ahead exploded into fire. The Zero's 20mm cannon struck his right-wing root. The P-39 shuddered. Fuel fumes filled the cockpit, and orange light bloomed under his feet. For a fraction of a second, Fowler thought he had been hit in the legs. Then he saw it, a sheet of flame racing up the bulkhead between his knees and the instrument panel. He kicked open the canopy. The rush of air made the fire hesitate, licking low and mean. The Airacobra's Allison engine coughed, recovered, and pulled him forward. Fowler pushed the nose down, desperate to blow the flames out. Below, the ocean shimmered an impossible blue. He thought of diving straight into it. Better the sea than burning alive. Half a mile away, Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yamazaki of the Tainan Air Group was fighting the same battle in reverse. His Zero, number 42 from Rabaul, had taken a burst of .30 caliber fire through the fuselage. He felt the jolt, smelled the raw gasoline, then saw the flicker behind his seat. For an instant the cockpit became a furnace. He yanked back on the stick, tearing away from the fight. The canopy glass blackened from smoke. There was no armor plate, no self-sealing tank, only thin aluminum between him and the fire. He screamed once, a sound no one heard over the engine's dying roar. Yamazaki's plane went down in a pillar of black smoke that trailed across the ocean like a scar. Fowler, meanwhile, leveled off, at 1,000 feet. The fire in his cockpit had gone out somehow. The right wing was scorched, the paint blistered, but the fuel tank behind it hissed instead of burning. When he landed back at Henderson Field, the mechanics stood silent around the wounded aircraft. They pried back the dented metal and found the miracle. The bullet holes oozing a thick, tar-colored resin that had swollen and sealed itself like scar tissue. That night, Fowler sat outside his tent with a cup of lukewarm coffee, staring at the stars above the jungle. He kept replaying the moment the fire had died, the way the smoke had turned from orange to grey and then simply vanished. He didn't understand it. None of them did. All he knew was that he had been one heartbeat away from burning alive, and some strange black glue inside his fuel tank had saved him. In the Pacific in 1942, cockpit fire was the pilot's true executioner. The men who flew knew the statistics, even if they never spoke them aloud. In the first 6 months of the Guadalcanal campaign, more than 60% of pilot deaths came not from bullets or flak, but from fire tanks ruptured by cannon shells, fuel lines ignited by tracers, cockpits turned into crematoriums before a man could unbuckle his harness. A Zero could disintegrate in mid-air after a single hit to its fuselage. The Aichi and Nakajima factories built aircraft for speed and range, not survival. Every pound of armor or rubber was a pound of performance lost. Japanese pilots accepted that bargain. Americans began to reject it. The difference was chemistry. In 1941, as Japanese aircraft swept the Pacific, a group of American engineers had quietly altered the inside of fuel tanks. Instead of bare aluminum, they lined the tanks with a dark, rubbery laminate made of vulcanized layers. The substance looked like something scraped from the bottom of a tar pit, sticky, soft, and faintly metallic. When a bullet passed through it, the heat and friction made the inner layer swell and fuse, closing the hole and choking off the flow of gasoline before it could ignite. It was an ugly, simple trick, and it worked. Pilots at first cursed the innovation. The new self-sealing tanks were heavier, cutting range by precious miles. Some maintenance crews complained about the smell, a mixture of raw, rubber, solvent, and burnt molasses that clung to their hands for days. But word spread quickly through the squadrons. Planes came home that should have been coffins. Men who should have burned were climbing out, shaken and blackened but alive. The Zero, by contrast, carried its main fuel tank like a bomb under the pilot's chest. Unarmored, unlined, a thin aluminum drum that made every tracer a fuse. Japanese engineers knew the risk, but had no alternative. Japan's aviation industry, starved of natural rubber and synthetic substitutes, could not produce the complex compounds required for self-sealing linings. In post-war interrogations, captured engineers would admit the truth. "We had the drawings," one said, "but not the chemicals." At Henderson Field, the difference became visible in the wreckage that littered the edges of the runway. American aircraft often landed smoking but intact, their tires melting on the tarmac, wings pocked with holes that bled dark resin. Japanese wrecks were different. They were twisted skeletons, surrounded by black rings of burned grass. The men who flew them rarely survived long enough to be captured. Among pilots, fear of fire was primal. It haunted their dreams more than enemy guns. Lieutenant Charles Dunn of the 49th Fighter Group once wrote in a letter home, "You can outturn a Zero, you can outclimb him if you catch him right, but if that tank goes, you're finished. I'd rather take a bullet in the head than be cooked alive." The self-sealing tanks changed that calculus. They gave pilots a fighting chance to get out, or, sometimes, to bring the airplane back. By the autumn of 1942, American engineers had refined the process. The standard tank consisted of 4 layers: an inner fuel-resistant rubber, a sandwich of raw gum that swelled on contact with gasoline, a vulcanized neoprene layer, and an outer fabric casing. The construction looked crude, but was the result of precise experimentation, a glue, as mechanics called it, that responded to damage by expanding rather than tearing. The men who had invented it worked in obscurity in Akron and Dayton, far from the front lines. Pilots never learned their names. They just called them the glue men. Japanese intelligence officers interrogating downed American airmen began to hear the same description: tanks that healed themselves, rubber that swallowed bullets. In a report dated December 1942, translated after the war by Allied interpreters, one Japanese officer described the material bitterly as "coward's armor. It allows them to run away after being hit." To American survivors, it was the opposite. It allowed them to live long enough to fight again. For Fowler, the realization came weeks later, when his crew chief cut open the damaged section of his P-39's wing. The inner lining had turned into a viscous mass, sealing the punctures almost perfectly. "Hell of a thing," the chief muttered, holding up a piece of the material. "Looks like tar, smells like death, but it saved your hide." Fowler touched the hardened edge. It was rough, rubbery, still faintly warm. He didn't know what it was, only that it had turned fire into smoke and death into life. From then on, every time Fowler climbed into his fighter, he patted the side of the fuselage where the fuel tank sat and whispered the same words under his breath. "Do it again, glue. Just do it again." He wasn't alone. Across the Pacific, in every squadron from Guadalcanal to New Guinea, pilots began to trust that unseen chemistry more than luck or armor. They didn't know the science. They didn't care. What mattered was simple. When the bullets came and the gasoline hissed, the fire no longer won every time. And in that small, sticky miracle, the tide of survival quietly began to turn. Akron, Ohio. Winter of 1939. The city smelled of rubber and steam. Inside a squat brick building on Seiberling Street, the sound of compressors thumped through the concrete floor as a man in a stained white coat bent over a vat of dark liquid that hissed when stirred. His name was Dr. Benjamin Holmes. To the factory workers at Goodyear Aircraft, he was known simply as the mad chemist with the glue. Holmes was 41 years old, tall and stooped, with nicotine-stained fingers and spectacles permanently fogged with solvent residue. He had once taught industrial chemistry at the University of Akron, before the Depression forced him into contract work for whoever would pay. In 1938, he received an unusual assignment from the Army Air Corps Materiel Division at Wright Field. Find a way to make an airplane's fuel tank heal itself. At first, the request seemed absurd. Gasoline and self-repair did not belong in the same sentence. Fuel vapors ignited at the lightest spark. Rubber dissolved when soaked in it. But Holmes had been studying something peculiar, a series of latex compounds that swelled when exposed to certain hydrocarbons. He had seen a tank of experimental sealant rupture under pressure, then close over its own tier as the solvent thickened. He called the reaction controlled suffocation. To his mind, it was as though the material were trying not to die. The Army engineers who reviewed his notes were unconvinced. They wanted lighter tanks, not heavier ones. Airplanes, they said, lived or died by pounds. Holmes ignored them. He requisitioned a disused laboratory space, borrowed curing ovens from the tire division, and began mixing batches of his tar-like compound in coffee tins. His formula was simple on paper: layers of natural rubber, vulcanized neoprene, and a gum-like intermediate that expanded when touched by fuel. But every variable mattered: temperature, humidity, cure time, even the color of the carbon black used for reinforcement. He tested hundreds of combinations, recording them in small blue notebooks that still survive in the U.S. National Archives. By the spring of 1940, his workshop looked like a battlefield of failed experiments. Tanks exploded, bubbled, and leaked. One night, a vat overheated, coating the walls with smoking pitch. When the fire brigade arrived, Holmes was still taking notes. The next morning, his supervisor called him mad. The name stuck. What Holmes understood and the others did not was that chemistry could think faster than mechanics. A valve or armor plate reacted too slowly. Fire moved in fractions of seconds. Only a living chemical reaction, triggered instantly by impact and heat, could seal a hole before the gasoline found oxygen. "You don't stop fire by being strong," he wrote in 1941. "You stop it by choking it to death." The first successful test took place that autumn. Holmes poured a batch of the black compound between two sheets of cotton canvas, baked it, and bonded it inside a small aluminum tank. He filled the tank with aviation gasoline, then placed it 20 yards away on the proving ground. A sergeant fired a burst from a Browning .30 caliber machine gun. The tank jumped, hissed, and stayed whole. When the fumes cleared, the holes were ringed with swollen, sticky rubber that smelled of tar and victory. The gasoline dripped for a few seconds, then stopped completely. Word spread quickly through right field. Visitors from the Air Corps and the Navy came to see the miracle. Some left unimpressed. "It's too heavy," one colonel said. "No pilot will trade range for rubber." Holmes replied, "Then you'd better start training ghosts." In Britain, the Royal Air Force was already learning the same lesson in blood. After the Battle of Britain in 1940, the British Air Ministry made self-sealing tanks mandatory for all fighters. Surviving Spitfire pilots reported bullets punching through their wings with only minor leaks instead of infernos. American observers took notice, but the U.S. procurement system moved slowly. It took Pearl Harbor to force change. By early 1942, Goodyear, Firestone, and United States Rubber were producing thousands of Holmes's healing liners for every new fighter design: the Curtiss P-40, the Lockheed P-38, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. Holmes himself rarely left Ohio. He spent the war inside his lab, chain-smoking and dictating new formulas into a wire recorder. He fought constant battles with accountants who complained that his rubber compounds used scarce materials like toluene and reclaimed latex. Once, when a procurement officer tried to simplify the process by removing one layer, Holmes slammed his notebook shut and said, "Take it out and you'll be mailing home ashes, not pilots." By mid-1942, the Mad Chemist's glue was standard issue in every major American combat aircraft. Each tank was a miniature masterpiece: an inner bladder of fuel-resistant rubber, a middle swelling layer that reacted to gasoline, and an outer fabric armor bonded with vulcanized cement. The tanks were built by hand, seams rolled under pressure, then tested with live ammunition. Workers, many of them women, wore gloves coated in talc to handle the sticky material. They called it black silk. Every day, at the end of the shift, they washed their hands with gasoline to dissolve the residue, the very fuel the material was designed to tame. In March of 1943, a shipment of the new tanks arrived at Lockheed's plant in Burbank for installation in the P-38 Lightning. Engineers noticed the difference immediately. Bullet holes closed within seconds, often sealing so completely that mechanics had to cut the tanks open afterward to find the entry points. The Navy soon adapted the same technology for carrier aircraft, coating even auxiliary tanks with the compound. Yet, despite the miracles, Holmes never received fame. His patents were classified. The Army filed them under restricted aviation materials. When the press later asked where the self-sealing tank came from, officials credited a team of chemists. Holmes himself wrote a single line in his journal on the day of the announcement: "Let them have the credit, I have the ghosts." He died in 1951, quietly, without military honors. But his invention outlived him in steel and rubber and flame. Every pilot who walked away from a burning aircraft carried a piece of his mind inside the wings. The men who cursed the extra weight in their fighters would one day call it their salvation. In post-war interviews, many pilots tried to explain what it felt like, the difference between flying with a tank that could fight back and one that could not. Lieutenant Red Fowler, recalling his brush with death over Guadalcanal, said, "Before that glue, I was scared of fire every second. After it, I was just scared of bullets." That's a big improvement. Even Japanese intelligence officers took notice. Captured reports from the Imperial Navy's 4th Air Group mention enemy fuel tanks that bleed and close when struck. The Japanese engineers called it impossible. Their factories, starved of rubber and solvents by Allied blockades, could not replicate it. In 1945, during interrogation, one of them told his captors, "We knew the Americans had found something alive inside their machines. We could not find the same life in ours." And so, the mad chemist's glue passed quietly into legend, an unseen armor born not of steel or courage, but of stubborn chemistry, and one man's refusal to accept that burning alive was inevitable. It would prove, before the war was done, that salvation could come in a layer no thicker than a playing card. By the summer of 1942, American pilots in the Pacific were learning arithmetic the hard way. Every dogfight, every bombing run, every mission that left Henderson Field or Espiritu Santo carried with it a simple equation. How many gallons of fuel, how many miles to target, and how many minutes before fire decided your fate? Fire was the real killer, not bullets. The official reports from the 13th Air Force, preserved today in the U.S. National Archives, told the story in dry columns of numbers. Between May and October of 1942, more than 6 of every 10 combat aircraft lost over the Solomon Islands burned before or after impact. For every pilot shot through the cockpit, 3 more were consumed by their own fuel. Aviation gasoline, 100 octane, burned so fiercely that even the sea could not extinguish it. Pilots who bailed out over water often landed in a floating inferno. By comparison, the same records show that after the installation of self-sealing tanks, losses from fire dropped by more than half within 4 months. The mathematics of survival had changed. At Guadalcanal, ground crews began keeping their own informal tallies on the walls of maintenance huts. Flamed 9. Hit but home 23. Each hit but home meant a pilot who should have died but didn't. Sergeant Harold Keane of the 67th Fighter Squadron remembered chalking the scores himself. "It wasn't science to us," he said after the war. "It was magic. Planes came in, smoking, leaking, hissing. We'd patch the skin, pull the tank, and find the holes sealed up tight, like the plane had healed overnight." The improvement spread through every theatre where the American flag flew. In North Africa, P-40s and Spitfires, fitted with the new tanks, survived direct cannon hits from Messerschmitts. In the Aleutians, P-39s returned with wings shredded by flak, yet unburned. But nowhere was the effect more visible than in the South Pacific, where fuel was both lifeline and curse. Pilots in the Pacific fought at ranges unthinkable in Europe, 300 miles to the target, sometimes more. Every gallon mattered, and every ounce of armor or rubber cut their reach. That was why the first generation of fighters, P-39s, Wildcats, and even early P-38s, had been reluctant to carry the self-sealing liners in full. "We thought weight would kill us," Lieutenant Charles Dunn wrote in his diary in September 1942. "Turned out fire killed us faster." The shift in survival rates proved him right. By early 1943, with all American fighters equipped with the new tanks, pilot fatality rates in crash landings dropped from nearly 70% to under 30%. The difference between dying and living had become measurable in millimeters of rubber. Yet the numbers did not tell the full story. They could not capture the psychological transformation that swept through the squadrons. Before, every tracer that arced past the canopy felt like a match waiting to strike. After the new tanks arrived, pilots began flying lower, pressing attacks longer, and taking risks they would never have dared before. They trusted their airplanes again. Japanese intelligence noticed the change. Reports recovered from Rabaul after the war describe American fighters that continue to fly after being hit repeatedly. One Japanese pilot wrote bitterly, "Their courage grows from some invisible armor." He did not know that the armor was chemical, not moral. At the 13th Fighter Command's operations tent on Espiritu Santo, statisticians began graphing sortie outcomes on long rolls of paper tacked to plywood boards. The curves told a new truth. A pilot's chance of survival after sustaining fuel system damage rose from 1 in 5 to 4 in 5. In cold numbers, it was simple. For every 5 men hit, 4 came home. That single shift rippled through the war's logistics like an electric current. A trained combat pilot was the rarest commodity in the Pacific, harder to replace than planes, ships, or bullets. Japan's pre-war training pipeline produced roughly 900 pilots a year. The United States, by 1944, was training 30,000 annually, but only because the men who survived became instructors. Each man saved by a self-sealing tank became, in time, a multiplier. The self-sealing tank did more than protect a pilot's life. It preserved the continuity of experience. Surviving pilots returned to teach gunnery, formation, flying, and survival tactics to the next generation. Those lessons became the foundation for the air dominance that followed. "Every plane that didn't burn," wrote Colonel Hubert Zemke years later, "was a school in the sky." By mid-1943, even the combat statisticians began to sense they were witnessing something larger than engineering success. The act of survival itself was turning into a weapon. Each rescued pilot represented not just one life saved, but future missions flown, future kills scored, and future morale preserved. The mathematics of abundance, so visible in America's factories and food, had found its mirror in the mathematics of endurance. And through it all, no one thought much about the chemist in Akron who had made it possible. The pilots did not know his name. They only knew the smell, the faint, tar-like sweetness that hung in the cockpit when the tanks were new. To them, that smell meant safety. It meant that if the worst happened, they might still have time to pull out of the dive, nurse the engine, and see the coastline again. It meant that for the first time in the war, fire no longer had the final word. Eglin Field, Florida, January of 1943. The morning air hung thick with kerosene and cordite. Rows of test tanks, each painted dull grey and numbered in chalk, sat beneath the observation stand. The smell was unbearable. Raw gasoline, scorched rubber, and the metallic tang of spent ammunition. This was the proving ground, where the mad chemist's glue faced its truest trial. Captain Robert Kittredge, an ordnance officer from Wright Field, stood with a clipboard under his arm. His job was to record exactly how many holes a tank could take before it caught fire. Around him, a dozen engineers in leather jackets prepared the weapons. 50 caliber Brownings, 30 caliber carbines, and even the 20mm Hispano cannons used by the RAF. They were about to do what every pilot feared most: shoot fuel tanks full of gasoline at close range. Each test followed the same pattern. The gunner fired a 3-second burst from 50 yards. The rounds tore through the tank, sending up geysers of vaporized fuel. For a heartbeat, it seemed inevitable that everything would ignite. Then, miraculously, the holes began to ooze black resin, bubbling like tar under summer sun. The leaking slowed, the fumes thickened, and the fire never came. Kittredge leaned forward, stopwatch in hand, noting every second until the flow stopped. 6 seconds, he said, sealed. A few drops of fuel hissed on the concrete and went dark. Behind him, one of the engineers exhaled a long breath. "That glue's alive," he muttered. Across the Pacific, the same test was being performed under fire rather than in safety. In New Guinea, Captain Richard Bong, who would later become America's top ace, reported returning from missions with fuel tanks shredded by shrapnel, yet no fire. "The stuff just swells and stinks," he wrote to his crew chief, "but I'll take the smell over flames any day." The Air Force Historical Research Agency's debriefing reports from the 13 Fighter Command, dated April 18, 1943, describe the phenomenon in bureaucratic understatement. Self-sealing tank performance satisfactory. Numerous aircraft returned with multiple perforations and no ignition. What those dry words concealed was the transformation of survival itself. The Japanese, meanwhile, were still flying aircraft that burned like paper lanterns. Their war diaries, later captured and translated by the Allied translator and interpreter, section tell of horror in the skies. A single tracer could turn a zero into a comet. Pilots learned to bail out the moment they smelled gasoline. Those who hesitated vanished in smoke. In contrast, American pilots began developing new habits. They stayed in damaged aircraft longer, trusting their tanks to hold. They turned back toward base instead of jumping into the sea. Mechanics noticed the difference. Aircraft that once would have crashed into the jungle were now landing with wings full of bullet holes. At Henderson Field, it became common to see ground crews pry open tanks and find layers of swollen rubber fused into hard, black scars. The engineers at Eglin wanted proof beyond anecdote. They took the same tanks that had survived live fire, cut them open, and studied the wounds. Under magnification, the pattern was unmistakable. The bullet channels were lined with hardened resin, each surrounded by concentric rings of swollen gum. The process was purely chemical, no valves, no pressure systems, no human intervention. The heat of the projectile itself had triggered the reaction. Kittredge's final report ran 50 pages, filled with figures and tables. But one sentence stood out, later quoted by the National World War II Museum. The introduction of self-sealing fuel tanks has reduced the incidence of in-flight fire by approximately 60% across all combat aircraft classes. It is no exaggeration to state that thousands of pilots owe their survival to this development. By the middle of 1943, the system was so trusted that even bombers adopted it. The B-17 Flying Fortress carried self-sealing tanks in its wings, while the new B-24 Liberator used a refined compound that swelled faster. When German flak shredded the bombers over Bremen and Schweinfurt, their wings often bled black rubber instead of flame. Still, the chemistry was not perfect. The glue could seal bullet holes but not high-explosive ruptures. If a tank was torn wide open, nothing could stop ignition. And the material aged poorly under tropical humidity. Pilots stationed in the Solomons joked that their magic glue sweated worse than they did. Even so, they trusted it more than they trusted chance, armor, or prayer. When American intelligence officers interrogated captured Japanese airmen in late 1943, one of them, Lieutenant Masao Horikoshi, described watching a P-38 take 3 direct cannon hits to its wings without catching fire. "We thought the pilot must be blessed by a god," he said. "Now I know it was chemistry." The irony was profound. Japan's own scientists had once experimented with similar materials, but lacked the toluene and rubber to make them viable. Blockades and shortages had starved their laboratories long before the Pacific skies filled with fire. At Eglin Field, as the last tank of the day sealed itself shut, Kittredge snapped his notebook closed. "That'll do," he said quietly. "If this doesn't win the war, it'll at least let the men live long enough to fight it." The mad chemist's glue had passed its trial by flame. From that moment onward, it was not just an invention, it was a covenant between engineer and aviator, between laboratory and battlefield. The black glue that oozed and hardened in the heart of every airplane had become something larger than chemistry. It was, in every sense, the science of survival. November of 1943. The clouds over Bougainville hung low and bruised, rolling with thunder. Below them, a flight of P-38 Lightnings cut through the air like silver blades, engines howling in synchrony. They were part of the 339th Fighter Squadron, escorting B-25 Mitchell bombers on a raid against Japanese supply lines. Among the pilots was Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Ralston, 22 years old, born in Kansas, and already carrying the weary calm of men who had seen too much sky. At 8,000 feet, the formation crossed the coast. The jungle below was a green ocean. Flack began to blossom among the clouds, black flowers that shattered the air with metallic petals. Ralston felt the plane tremble. His left wing dipped as shrapnel tore through the outer fuel tank. The cockpit filled with the smell of gasoline, raw and sweet, the smell every pilot feared most. He glanced down. The fuel gauge was dropping fast, the tank hissing like a boiling kettle. In his headset, his wingman's voice crackled. "Jimmy, you're hit!" "I know," Ralston said. He was waiting for the fire, waiting for that sudden burst of light that meant death. But it didn't come. Instead, the hissing slowed. The smell faded. He looked out and saw the bullet holes bleeding black resin that glistened in the sunlight. The tank was sealing itself alive, moving, healing. For 30 seconds, he watched in disbelief as the black glue swelled and hardened, suffocating the leak. The engine kept running. The fire never started. They finished the mission. When Ralston landed at Torokina, the ground crew gathered around his aircraft, tracing the sealed holes with their fingers. One of them, a sergeant from Oklahoma, said softly, "She should have been ash, Lieutenant. You got yourself an angel in that tank." Ralston only nodded. He didn't know the chemist's name, but he silently thanked him all the same. That day was not unique. Across the Pacific, similar stories filled after-action reports. Fuel system hit no ignition. Tank sealed itself, returned safely. Crew unharmed despite heavy damage. The miracle repeated so often that the extraordinary became routine. But what happened over Bougainville marked a turning point. It was the first time the Japanese Air Command realized that their bullets were no longer winning the war of attrition. The captured war diary of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 4th Air Group, now preserved in Tokyo's defense archives, recorded the shock. Enemy aircraft struck multiple times did not burn. Self-repairing tanks suspected. Countermeasures unavailable. The Japanese pilots had no such protection. Their Zeros, Hayabusas, and Betty bombers still carried plain metal tanks. American tracers sliced through them like torches. Lieutenant Ralston would later write in his logbook, "When a Zero goes, it's not a plane anymore, it's a star falling." The Americans began to notice a grim contrast. In every dogfight, the sky filled with fireballs that were almost always Japanese. Pilots stopped calling it luck. They started calling it the glue, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey for the Pacific Theater later calculated that self-sealing technology reduced aircraft losses by nearly 2/3 between early 1942 and late 1943. That translated to thousands of men alive who otherwise would have burned. For every plane that made it back leaking but unlit, the supply line of experience and morale remained unbroken. At the field hospitals behind the front, medics noticed the change too. Fewer men arrived with burns. More arrived with simple wounds, broken bones, shrapnel, concussions. It was an invisible revolution, fought not with guns but with chemistry. Still, for the men in the air, the terror of fire never disappeared completely. Even with self-sealing tanks, the first whiff of gasoline could freeze the blood. Ralston later said in an interview, "You never forgot that smell. The glue could stop the flames, but not the memory." After Bougainville, reports of the black bleeding tanks reached Washington. The Air Force Historical Research Agency records show that on December 21, 1943, the Chief of Materiel issued an internal memo recommending expanded production of the Goodyear-Holmes laminate compound, the very formula first mixed by Dr. Benjamin Holmes in his Akron lab. By early 1944, nearly every American combat aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports, and patrol planes carried his chemistry inside their wings. In one of his few surviving letters, written from Bougainville after the mission, Ralston tried to describe the feeling. "They told us there's something in the tanks that plugs the holes. I don't know what it is, looks like black honey when it comes out. Whatever it is, it's the difference between a grave and a beer after landing. We joke that the glue has a soul. Maybe it does. I figure every drop of it's got a little bit of home inside." His words captured something no report could measure: the quiet bond between invention and survival. Men like Ralston did not know the name of the scientist who saved them. Holmes never met the pilots who owed him their lives. Yet between the laboratory in Ohio and the cockpits over Bougainville stretched a single thread of resilience, sticky, black, and utterly human. When the last P-38 rolled into its revetment that evening, the sunset turned the fuel stains on the runway into streaks of gold. The mechanics washed their hands in gasoline, the same liquid their tanks had learned to tame. Somewhere far away, in a quiet office in Akron, a chemist's formula sat in a metal filing cabinet marked confidential. But its proof was written in the skies in every airplane that landed when it should have burned, and in every man who climbed down from the cockpit still breathing. In a windowless laboratory at the Goodyear Aircraft Corporation in Akron, Ohio, a man everyone called Doc Ben stirred a vat of tar that wasn't supposed to exist. The year was 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor was still months away, but the smell of war already hung in the air: rubber, oil, and urgency. The chemist's real name was Dr. Benjamin S. Holmes, a quiet man with a shock of graying hair and a habit of talking to himself while he worked. Holmes was not a soldier, nor a pilot. He had never left the country, never seen a fighter plane in combat, and yet, within 2 years, his creation would save more aviators than any bulletproof vest or escape hatch ever could. His peers in the factory called him eccentric. His supervisors, desperate for solutions, called him essential. The problem before him was simple to describe and impossible to solve: stop airplane fuel tanks from turning into fireballs. When a bullet pierced an aircraft's skin, the fuel sprayed into vapor and ignited instantly. Engineers had tried everything: thick rubber linings, double-walled tanks, even detachable fuel pods that could be jettisoned before they exploded. Nothing worked. Holmes, who had spent a decade studying adhesives, proposed something strange. "Don't stop the leak," he said during a design meeting in May of 1941. "Let it bleed, but let the blood clot." The other engineers stared at him as if he had gone mad. "You want a tank that bleeds?" one asked. Holmes only smiled. "A living tank," he said. "One that heals itself." The idea came from biology. Holmes had studied how tree sap thickened when exposed to air, how wounds sealed through chemical change rather than mechanical force. He wanted to mimic that in fuel. He began mixing toluene, natural latex, and asphalt, cooking them together until the compound turned into a heavy, tar-like syrup. When poured onto fabric, it formed a flexible laminate that could expand under heat and pressure. He spread the sheets across his lab bench and fired pistol rounds into them. The bullets tore holes, and within seconds the holes closed, oozing black resin that hardened like scar tissue. The first report he submitted to the Army Air Corps was met with skepticism. "Too messy," one officer wrote. "Unreliable under altitude conditions." But the military needed answers, and so Goodyear was authorized to build a series of prototypes. By early 1942, Holmes and a handful of technicians were boiling rubber in steel drums day and night. The process was as crude as it was revolutionary. Each tank began as a sandwich of 3 layers: an inner rubber bladder, a middle layer of Holmes's reactive compound, and an outer fabric coating treated with neoprene. The key was balance too much glue and the tank became rigid and heavy, too little and it wouldn't seal. Holmes tested hundreds of combinations, firing into each one at different temperatures, altitudes, and fuel loads. The lab smelled of burnt gasoline for months. His notebooks, later preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency archives, read like a battle diary. Trial number 42. Total combustion. Trial number 43. Partial seal. Trial number 46. Success. Immediate sealing within 4 seconds. Word began to spread through the technical corps. Someone at Wright Field dubbed the formula Holmes's glue. Someone else called it pilot's skin. But among the mechanics who installed it, the nickname that stuck was Mad Glue. It was, in their words, too ugly to be science. By the summer of 1942, the new self-sealing tanks were being fitted into P-38s, P-Thunderbolts, and B-25 bombers. Pilots who had trained in aircraft without them could feel the difference in weight, and handling the glue added hundreds of pounds, but they didn't complain. After the first few missions where men returned alive from fuel strikes, no one dared. When Holmes was finally invited to observe the results at Wright Field in late 1942, he stood behind the safety glass as technicians filled one of his tanks with gasoline, then riddled it with machine gun fire. The fuel frothed and sprayed, and for a second, flames flickered across the surface. Then they vanished. The tank hissed and bled black resin until the leaks stopped. The smell of burnt rubber filled the hangar. Holmes didn't cheer. He simply closed his notebook and said, "That will do." What he didn't know, what he could never have imagined, was that less than a year later, over Bougainville and Rabaul and Truk Lagoon, thousands of pilots would owe their lives to that same black ooze. Japanese intelligence, baffled by the sudden drop in Allied aircraft fires, began collecting wrecked American fighters and analyzing their tanks. In a captured Japanese report now housed at the National World War II Museum, one officer described the discovery. Inside the enemy tanks is a dark material which swells like flesh when shot. It smells of asphalt. We call it the coward's armor. Holmes would never hear that phrase during the war, but he might have smiled at its irony. His invention, born from chemistry and desperation, had turned cowardice into survival. By 1944, Goodyear's production lines were churning out more than 1,000 tanks per month. The same black glue that once filled a chemist's coffee tins now lined the wings of every American fighter crossing the Pacific. Holmes, still working 12-hour days in his Akron lab, received a letter from a pilot in the Solomons. It was short and written in pencil. "You don't know me, but your tanks saved me yesterday. They shot me full of holes. I landed anyway. I owe you my life." The chemist pinned that letter above his workbench and never took it down. He died years later, still surrounded by the smell of rubber and toluene, never famous, never rich. But the numbers tell his legacy better than any monument could. By the end of 1945, over 30,000 American aviators had survived crashes or combat hits because their fuel tanks did not ignite. The man who taught machines to bleed and heal had rewritten the physics of fear. April 18, 1943. 6P-38. Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron cut low across the Solomon Sea, their twin booms slicing through morning haze like silver scalpels. The mission was secret, improvised, and suicidal, 1,000 miles round trip from Guadalcanal to intercept the most guarded man in the Japanese Empire, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor. The operation would be called Vengeance. Every drop of fuel mattered. Each Lightning carried tanks swollen with 180 gallons of high-octane gasoline, more than enough to turn the aircraft into a flying torch if hit. Pilots had seen it happen before. A single tracer, a single shell, and the cockpit became an oven. Yet on this morning, beneath those aluminum skins, the black alchemy of Benjamin Holmes lay waiting. Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr. led the high cover flight. Below him, Major John Mitchell's navigation held them steady, hugging the sea to avoid radar. For 2 hours, they skimmed the waves, engines tuned to the rhythm of endurance. The tropical air was heavy with salt and fuel vapor. Lanphier later wrote, "You could smell the gasoline through the oxygen mask." We all knew what that meant: one hit, and the Pacific would have 6 more fires. When the coastline of Bougainville appeared ahead, they climbed. Mitchell's voice crackled through the radio. "Eagle flight, time to climb, 20 minutes to intercept." The ambush unfolded with surgical precision. At 9:35 a.m., the formation of G-4M Betty bombers appeared. Below, 2 of them flanked by Zero escorts Yamamoto's personal flight from Rabaul to Balale. The Americans dove from 5,000 feet. Sunlight flashed off their propellers as the P-38s fell like judgment. The Japanese never saw them coming. Captain Rex Barber's first burst shredded the right engine of the lead Betty. Flames erupted from the wing root, trailing a white tail of smoke. Inside, Yamamoto's aide saw the admiral's face calm, almost resigned, as the aircraft rolled into the jungle canopy. It struck the trees with a sound like thunder. Barber pulled up through the debris cloud, the left wing of his Lightning riddled with holes but no fire. When the surviving pilots returned to Guadalcanal, their aircraft were pocked with bullet strikes. Fuel tanks wept black resin down the wings. Ground crews counted 43 hits on Barber's machine, 21 on Lanphier's. Not one caught fire. The squadron's maintenance log, now archived at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, notes simply, "All aircraft returned, tanks self-sealed. No losses." That single line carried the weight of history. Without those tanks, without Holmes's glue, the operation could never have succeeded. A 1,000-mile mission meant no bailout zone, no lifeboats, no rescue. A punctured tank would have meant death by flame or drowning. The self-sealing laminate had transformed the impossible into the achievable. After the mission, intelligence officers gathered the pilots for debriefing. Colonel William McCoy, head of the 13th Fighter Command, asked the question that every pilot secretly wondered. "Were any of you hit in the tanks?" Lanphier laughed. "All of us," he said. "But they bled black and kept us alive." News of Yamamoto's death electrified the Allied world, but in laboratories across America, it meant something else entirely. The first real-world validation of chemistry as armor. At Wright Field, engineers replayed the mission data, calculating the odds. Over 1,000 miles of flight, hundreds of enemy rounds fired, 6 aircraft returned 0 fires. It defied every previous combat pattern. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later described the event as a confluence of precision flying, intelligence, success, and material superiority. But the last factor, the invisible one, was the most decisive. The survey's appendix quietly credited the self-sealing system employed in P-38 auxiliary tanks as a determining factor in mission survivability. The Japanese, too, studied the wreckage. When they recovered the remains of Yamamoto's Betty, investigators found that it had burned with unnatural speed. The lightweight aluminum skin and unprotected fuel tanks had turned the aircraft into an inferno within seconds of being hit. Their report, later captured by the Allies, contained a note of grim admiration. Enemy fighters withstand fuel tank damage that would consume ours instantly. For the men of the 339th, survival carried its own strange burden. They had killed the enemy's most famous admiral, but more than that, they had witnessed firsthand the power of their machines. Barber's crew chief recalled draining the remaining fuel from his bullet-scarred tank and watching it seal again. "It looked like something alive," he said, like the plane didn't want to die. In the months that followed, Holmes's compound was modified for tropical climates, mixed with new stabilizers to resist mold and humidity. Engineers nicknamed the improved version Yamamoto's Revenge. Every new aircraft rolling off Lockheed's production line carried it in its wings. By late 1943, pilots who had once dreaded the word fire began to speak of leaks instead, a semantic shift that meant survival had become normal. Yet the ghosts of the old fear lingered. In letters home, they still wrote about the smell, the faint, sweet tar that hung in the air after a hit. "That smell means you're still alive," one pilot wrote. When post-war historians examined Operation Vengeance decades later, they saw not just a tactical success, but a technological milestone. The mission symbolized the point when American chemistry caught up to and surpassed its enemy's engineering. It proved that protection could be built not from armor plates, but from understanding the behavior of molecules under fire. In 1962, during a joint U.S. Japanese aviation symposium in Tokyo, an aging engineer from the wartime Imperial Navy spoke quietly to an American counterpart. "We studied your fuel tanks after Yamamoto was killed," he said. "We called it black flesh. It was alive, we thought." The American, an Air Force historian, smiled. "It wasn't alive," he said. "It was a chemist in Akron." The Japanese engineer nodded. "Then he was a very wise man." And so, in the long ledger of war, where victory is usually measured in bombs dropped or enemies destroyed, the true legacy of Operation Vengeance was written in the quiet resilience of chemistry. 6 lightnings had flown into 1,000 miles of danger, and all 6 had returned, their wings weeping black glue that sealed the sky between life and death. The mad chemist's glue had not only avenged Pearl Harbor, it had proven, beyond all doubt, that in modern war, survival itself was an invention. By early 1944, the war's front lines stretched across the world, but the beating heart of American air power pulsed far from any battlefield in the endless industrial plains of the Midwest. On the outskirts of Akron, Ohio, where rubber once ruled the peacetime economy, the Goodyear plant had transformed into something almost mythic, a cathedral of chemistry and noise, where the mad chemist's glue was borne by the ton. Inside, beneath the factory's corrugated roof, rows of steel vats bubbled with molten latex and asphalt. The smell was unforgettable, a mixture of burnt tar, engine oil, and ozone. Women in overalls and headscarves stirred the black mixture with long paddles, their faces glistening in the heat. Men cut sheets of treated fabric, their hands moving with the precision of surgeons. In the far corners, chemists hunched over test benches, timing how long it took bullet holes to seal. Every tank was a small miracle waiting to happen. The process looked primitive but was guided by science. First, rubberized fabric was laid out on steel molds, shaped like the internal contours of a wing. The inner layer, pure latex, treated with antioxidants, gave the tank flexibility. Next came the heart of the system, the Holmes compound, thick and tarry, painted on by hand in slow, deliberate strokes. When heated, it bonded to the inner layer like skin to flesh. Finally, a protective outer shell of neoprene-coated canvas was stretched and baked into place. Each finished tank was then submerged in water, pressurized with air, and inspected for leaks. If a single bubble escaped, it was scrapped. "Every one of these is a man's life," Supervisor Clara Higgins told her team during a production shift in March 1944. She had lost her husband at Bataan and now ran an assembly line with 40 women under her command. "So we don't just make tanks," she said. "We build parachutes you can't see." By that spring, Goodyear and its subcontractors were producing nearly 10,000 self-sealing tanks a month, enough to equip every new P-47, P-38, and P-51 rolling off American assembly lines. The numbers were staggering. Each tank required 8 miles of seam stitching, 12 pounds of adhesive compound, and 48 hours of curing time. The Akron plant alone consumed 2 million gallons of latex annually, much of it shipped in secret convoys guarded as carefully as explosives. The United States had weaponized chemistry as thoroughly as it had weaponized steel. Government inspectors visited constantly. Representatives from the Air Materiel Command prowled the production floor with clipboards and calipers. They carried fragments of bullet-riddled tanks returned from the front, displaying them like holy relics. One such piece, a scorched panel from a thunderbolt that survived over France, bore a handwritten note. Hit by cannon fire. Pilot safe. Send more like this. Workers took turns touching it for luck before returning to their stations. At the nearby Firestone plant, engineers experimented with alternate formulas compounds that could cure faster or resist tropical rot. Some batches used reclaimed latex from Brazil, others synthetic rubber from the new Buna factories, but none matched Holmes's original recipe for reliability. Its exact proportions, a blend of latex, asphalt, zinc oxide, and toluene resin, were kept in a locked cabinet, known jokingly among the chemists as the Ark. Dr. Holmes himself still worked there, though his hair had gone white and his hearing dulled from years of machinery. He had become something of a legend, the quiet man who refused promotion, who preferred to test samples personally. He kept a small black notebook in his breast pocket, where he recorded every variation of the formula, every change in viscosity or reaction time. Colleagues said he treated the glue as though it were alive. One afternoon, a reporter from Life magazine visited the factory, hoping to write about the miracle rubber-saving American pilots. Holmes declined to be photographed. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about the difference between burning and breathing." The article never ran. The technology was still classified. In letters from the front, the proof of the factory's work returned in ink and gratitude. A pilot from the 99th Fighter Squadron, the Tuskegee Airmen, wrote, "They hit me, square in the belly tank over Anzio. I saw the holes, smelled the gas, waited for fire. Nothing. When I landed, I kissed the wing. Please tell whoever made that tank they built me a second chance." The workers read the letter aloud on the factory floor. Some cried. Others simply nodded and went back to their benches, sewing, painting, sealing. It was the kind of work that didn't just build airplanes, it built purpose. By summer, the Army Air Forces had statistical proof of what the factory had accomplished. Fire-related fatalities in fighter aircraft had dropped by 70% since 1942. In bombers, the rate had fallen by half. Engineers calculated that for every 100 tanks produced, at least 15 pilots' lives were saved in combat. The numbers were so overwhelming that General Hap Arnold himself sent a commendation letter to Goodyear's management, praising the heroic labor of our home front scientists and workers. Holmes never replied to the commendation. He simply wrote a single sentence in his notebook: "We built 1,000 hearts today." As the war turned toward victory, the black glue from Akron spread far beyond American wings. The British incorporated it into their typhoons and mosquitoes. The Australians lined their Kitty Hawks with it. Even captured German engineers later studied fragments of the material, baffled by its consistency. At the end of 1944, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey conducted a quiet inspection of the Akron facility. Their final report, classified until decades later, concluded, "Without the successful large-scale manufacture of self-sealing fuel tanks, Allied air losses would have doubled in both theaters." The ability to survive fuel system damage proved decisive in sustaining pilot availability and morale. The contribution of chemical engineering to the outcome of the air war cannot be overstated. By then, Holmes's invention had saved more men than anyone could count. And yet, when peace came, the Goodyear factory shut down its war lines overnight. The vats cooled, the glue hardened in forgotten barrels. Workers returned to making tires, unaware that their hands had shaped the chemistry of survival. In the silence that followed the war, Dr. Benjamin Holmes packed away his black notebook and took a single jar of the compound home. He set it on a shelf in his workshop, where it caught the morning light like a lump of obsidian. When asked years later why he had kept it, he said quietly, "It reminds me that science can burn or it can heal. We chose to make it heal. The war was over, the factories slept, but the black glue and the lives it saved remained the quietest miracle of all."